Before we get into this, I'd love to know, where in the world are you right now? What city? What time? Drop it in the comments. It genuinely matters to us knowing where these stories land. Now, there's a place buried in the hills of eastern Kentucky that most people have never heard of. And there's a reason for that. The ridges and hollows of Appalachia were never the kind of land that opened its arms to outsiders. You could come, sure. You could settle in. But the mountains had a way of swallowing newcomers whole, folding them into the mist, the silence, the bone-deep cold of valleys where even echoes couldn't survive. The people born there understood this instinctively. They'd grown up reading the shape of ridgelines the way city folk read street signs. They carried a kind of knowledge in their blood that no fortune or education could replicate. And the central truth they all understood was simple. Black Mountain never gave you anything for free. Whatever you pulled from it came attached to a cost, and that cost was never written in any contract. Still, the men kept coming. 7 miles east of what passed for a town center, at the dead end of a road the county had never bothered to pave or maintain, sat the Holbrook estate. A 3-story house built in the federal style back in 1847, its white paint long since turned to a dingy gray under decades of mountain weather. You could only catch a glimpse of it in winter, after the oaks and hickories dropped enough leaves to let a sliver of the structure through. Come spring or summer, the forest closed around it completely, as if the mountain itself had drawn a curtain. Ray Dunford knew about the property because a man named Gibbs Cordell, who worked alongside him and was loosely connected to one of the old families, though he never said how, had let something slip once in conversation. Something Gibbs clearly wished he hadn't said. Ray filed it away with the patience of a man who understood that in a town like Harland, the subjects people avoided were exactly the subjects that mattered most. He shared what he'd gathered with Thomas on a Saturday evening, 3 weeks after Thomas had stumbled onto something deep inside the lower reaches of Shaft 4. Thomas hadn't breathed a word about the sealed passage to anyone during those weeks. He'd gone back to his shifts, kept his eyes open, listened to what people said and didn't say, and waited, with the same quiet endurance that had gotten him through 2 failed harvests and a move across state lines with $11 to his name. But those 4 words carved into stone hadn't let go of him. They sat in the back of his mind the way a thorn sits beneath skin, not always sharp, but never gone. When Ray started talking about the families, Thomas leaned in closer than usual. 4 families, 1 mountain. Elias Holbrook had shown up in Harland County in 1831, a government-contracted land surveyor out of Richmond, Virginia, with a convenient eye for mineral deposits that his official duties let him quietly identify and even more quietly acquire. Within 5 years, he'd assembled the mineral rights to nearly 40% of Black Mountain's eastern slope. Through a mix of legitimate purchases and arrangements, the historical record described only in vague, careful language. The Warfields arrived 10 years later, built on timber wealth. Augustus Warfield had cleared the lower ridges of Black Mountain with ruthless efficiency all through the 1840s and 1850s, never replanting a single tree, and used the profits to snap up mineral rights that bordered Holbrook's holdings. The 2 families, recognizing the obvious advantage of cooperation, formalized their alliance through a business partnership in 1857 and cemented it through marriage in 1863. Elias Holbrook's granddaughter wed to Augustus Warfield's eldest son. Then there were the Cordells and the Dunns, older families. Scotch-Irish settlers whose roots in the area went back before any formal survey or deed system existed. People who had simply been on the land when the mapmakers arrived and had been sharp enough to make sure their presence got put down on paper. The Cordells held the western mineral rights. The Dunns controlled the water rights to 3 creeks draining Black Mountain's northern face, a holding that would turn out to be the most consequential of them all. By 1890, These four families collectively controlled every way into the richest coal seams in eastern Kentucky. When the Consolidated Black Mountain Coal Company was incorporated in 1901, the founding papers listed all four families as principal stakeholders. The company's president was a businessman from Cincinnati named Howard Fitch. But everybody in Harlan County understood the arrangement. Fitch was a manager. The families were the owners. So what shifted in 1908? Ray had pieced most of this together from courthouse filings, conversations with older residents, and one extraordinary source. A retired schoolteacher named Miss Alma Pigg. She was 71 years old, had taught in Harlan County since 1879, and possessed the unsentimental candor of a woman who had outlived most of the people she'd once felt obligated to shield. She was willing to talk about things that younger folks in town would not. Miss Alma's house on Ivy Street was practically a fortress of books and yellowed newspapers, stacked so high that moving through the rooms required threading single file through narrow corridors between the towers. Ray had met her at a church gathering and recognized immediately that she was the most knowledgeable person in all of Harlan County. And that at 71, she understood full well her information would vanish with her unless she passed it on. The families left town in 1908 and 1909, Miss Alma had told Ray, seated in the only chair in her parlor, not buried under periodicals. All four of them, within 18 months. The Holbrooks went first, spring of '08, the Warfields that fall, the Cordells and Dunns the following year. What happened in 1908? Ray had asked. Miss Alma had looked at him with the steady patience of a woman who'd spent 4 decades teaching children to think before opening their mouths. In March of 1908, she said, 11 men died in Shaft 7 of the Consolidated Black Mountain Coal Company. The official determination was a gas explosion. The mine inspector's report, I've read it, described accumulated methane and a lamp malfunction as the cause. She paused. But Shaft 7 had operated for 4 years without a single gas incident. The ventilation system was considered among the best in the region. The foreman, George Blevins, had a spotless safety record, and the 11 men who died weren't scattered throughout the shaft. They were all concentrated in one place. Another pause. The north section, she said. Ray told Thomas everything that Saturday evening. They sat on the boarding house porch while Harlan's weekend noise drifted up from Central Street below. Thomas listened without breaking in. When Ray finished, Thomas sat with it for a long while. 11 men, Thomas said at last. All in one section. Ray confirmed. The north section of Shaft 7, and according to the shaft diagrams I pulled from the county surveyor's office, that section would have been positioned directly below and east of the north tunnel. Thomas finished. Ray studied him. You know something. Thomas told him about the sealed passage, about the 4 words chiseled above the wall of mortared stone. He hadn't planned to tell anyone. But Ray's information had reshaped the picture entirely. The sealed passage wasn't just a curiosity anymore. It was a thread tied to something larger. 11 dead men. 4 families who abandoned their town residences within a year and a half of those deaths. A warning etched into rock by someone who had known, or feared, what lay on the other side. Ray was quiet a long time after Thomas finished. We need to go see Pete Sorrell, Ray said. Pete doesn't talk, Thomas answered. Pete doesn't talk to people he hasn't decided to trust, Ray corrected. That's not the same thing. They found Pete on a Sunday afternoon in his rented room above the hardware store on Cumberland Avenue. He opened the door in his undershirt, scanned both their faces with those pale creek-water eyes, and stepped aside without saying a word. The room was spare. A bed, a table, 2 chairs, a shelf holding 4 books, and a Bible. Pete sat at the table while Thomas laid out the sealed passage, and Ray recounted Miss Alma's account of the 1908 disaster. Pete listened without any visible reaction, his hands flat on the tabletop, the posture of a man holding something inside himself tightly and not wanting it to show. When they were done, Pete said nothing for close to a minute. "My uncle worked shaft 7, he said finally. He wasn't one of the 11. He'd come down with influenza that week, got sent home 2 days before it happened. He lived to 78, and he never once spoke about what went on in that shaft. Not once. I asked him when I was a boy, and he looked at me like I'd started speaking some language he'd never encountered." "Did he know what was in the north section?" Thomas asked. Pete looked at his hands. "He knew what they'd been instructed to do down there," Pete said. "He told me that much once, near the end, when he was very old, and I think he'd decided it didn't matter anymore what he said." "What were the instructions?" Ray asked. Pete raised his eyes. "Take out whatever they found. Don't describe it. Not to the foreman, not to their wives, not to any minister. Pack it in crates. Seal the crates. Bring them to the surface." The crates were collected by men nobody recognized and hauled by wagon toward the Dunn property on North Creek. The room went still. "What was inside those crates?" Thomas asked. Pete shook his head slowly. "My uncle never knew, but he said the men who worked that section came back changed after a few weeks, quieter. He mentioned one man, somebody named Haskins, who started having fits. Trembling, confusion, couldn't tell you where he was. The company doctor called it nervous exhaustion. Haskins was let go in January of 1908. 2 months before the explosion, Ray said. 2 months before the explosion, Pete confirmed. He stood then, and Thomas understood the conversation was over. But at the door, Pete turned back. "I've been on this mountain 31 years, he said. "I've never filed a grievance, never stirred up trouble, never asked a question I wasn't supposed to. I'm not telling you that because I'm proud of it. I'm telling you so you understand what it means when I say what I'm about to say." He looked straight at Thomas. "Whatever's behind that wall, whatever the Dunns carted away in those wagons and took to their land on North Creek, it was worth more to those 4 families than the lives of 11 men. And those families have been rooted in this county for 80 years, and their reach extends further than you can imagine. And they are watching this mountain the same way they've always watched it." He pulled the door open. "Think carefully about what you go looking for," Pete said. "Because in my experience around here, the men who find things are the men who vanish." That night, Thomas sat at his desk and started writing to Eleanor. He managed 3 sentences before he stopped. He read them back. Then he folded the paper, slid it into the drawer, and didn't send it. He didn't yet know what lay behind the sealed wall in shaft 4. He didn't know what the Dunns had moved in those crates in 1908, or why 11 men had been killed, or how those deaths connected to the sudden disappearance of 4 prominent families from public life. But he grasped now that this wasn't some minor curiosity or company secret he'd bumped into. He was standing at the rim of something deep. In a county where the men who controlled the ground beneath his feet had shown 15 years earlier exactly how they calculated the value of a human life against whatever they were guarding. Thomas looked at the photograph of Eleanor and Ruth on the desk beside the lamp. He thought about 11 miners in a northern corridor, about crates loaded in darkness, about a 71-year-old retired teacher in a house stacked with newspapers who had kept this knowledge alive for a decade and a half because she understood that eventually someone would need it. He opened the drawer and pulled out the unfinished letter. He added a single line. "Eleanor, if you don't hear from me in more than 2 weeks, take Ruth to my brother James in Wise County and stay there until I write." He sealed the envelope. He mailed it the next morning. The Harlan County Recorder's office occupied one room on the ground floor of the courthouse, a stone building that carried a permanent odor of coal dust, aging paper, and the particular dampness that seeps into structures built too close to running water. The recorder, a thin man named Alton Seymour, showed up reliably on weekday mornings, and disappeared reliably every afternoon. A pattern that suggested a private agreement with himself about how much of his existence the county deserved. Ray went on a Wednesday morning when Alton was in, and when courthouse traffic was light enough that a man could sit with the deed records for an hour without drawing attention. He was looking for the Dunn property on North Creek. What he found was far more than he'd expected. The Dunns had assembled their North Creek holdings across 3 separate purchases between 1847 and 1861, stitching together a continuous parcel of roughly 340 acres along Black Mountain's northern drainage. The deed descriptions were typical for the era: meets and bounds references anchored to trees and rock outcroppings. The language of men measuring terrain with chains and compasses under heavy forest canopy. All perfectly ordinary, except for a single clause in the 1861 deed, recorded when Nathaniel Dunn transferred the property to his son Robert as part of an estate settlement. Ray copied it into his notebook word for word. Including and especially the subterranean formations known to the grantor, comprising those passages and chambers accessed from the northern drainage, which the grantor has caused to be secured, and which the grantee is hereby instructed to maintain in a secured condition, the contents thereof to remain undisturbed and unexamined by any party not previously authorized in writing by the principal families of record. Said authorization to require agreement of no fewer than 3 of the 4 principal families. The whole of this provision to remain in effect in perpetuity and to bind all heirs and assigns. Ray read it a second time. Then he leaned back and stared at the water-stained ceiling of the recorder's office for a long while. Subterranean formations, passages, chambers, contents to remain undisturbed, written in 1861, 62 years ago. Whatever existed beneath the Dunn property on North Creek had been locked down, guarded, and legally bound to future generations for more than 6 decades. The 4 families had erected a formal legal architecture around it. They'd embedded it in property law, and 11 men had died. Ray was now convinced of it, because they'd gotten too close from the wrong direction, from inside the mountain, through the north section of Shaft 7. He closed the deed book, returned it to its shelf, and stepped out of the courthouse into the sharp March air. Ray went back to Miss Alma that same afternoon. She was reading in her parlor and glanced up when he came in with an expression that suggested she'd been expecting his return and had merely been curious about how long it would take. Ray showed her the deed language he'd transcribed. Miss Alma read it once, rested the notebook on her knee, and looked through the window at the bare maple in her front yard. "I'd wondered whether that document still existed," she said softly. "You knew about it?" "I knew about what it referenced," she said. "Not from any written source. From a conversation I had in 1909, roughly 6 months after the Warfields departed." She paused, arranging her words with the precision of a woman who'd spent half a century being exact about language. "There was a man named Foster Dunning," she said. "No relation to the Dunn family. Different spelling entirely. He was a surveyor the coal company hired in 1906 to map the deeper sections of Black Mountain for potential new shaft locations. He was meticulous and he was honest, which, looking back, made him a poor fit for the job. What did he find? He found that the northern drainage of Black Mountain wasn't simply a network of natural cavities, Miss Alma said. He found signs of human activity, very old human activity, pre-settlement. He found chambers that had clearly been occupied and used. By whom, and for what exact purpose, he couldn't determine with certainty. He found material he described in his notes as artifacts of considerable age and apparent cultural significance. She paused again. He turned his survey into the company in December of 1906. He was paid and thanked. In January of 1907, the company brought in a second surveyor, a man from Louisville with no prior connection to Harlan County, to produce a revised version. The revised survey contained no mention of the northern chambers whatsoever. "And Dunning?" Ray asked. "Foster Dunning left Harlan County in February of 1907, Miss Alma said. "He took a position with a land company in Lexington. He wrote me a single letter in March of that year. We'd been friendly. He'd borrowed books from me while he was here, which is generally sufficient grounds for a correspondence." She reached into the stack of papers beside her chair with the practiced ease of someone who knew precisely where every item was, regardless of how the room looked. She produced a yellowed envelope and held it out. "You may read it," she said. "He's gone now. Passed in 1918. I think whatever confidentiality he requested has run its course." The letter was dated March 14th, 1907. The handwriting was small and exact. "Dear Miss Pigg, I write to you because you are among the few individuals I encountered in Harlan County whose judgment I trust without reservation, and because I find that I cannot carry what I know alone without sharing it with someone who will grasp its importance. What I discovered in the northern passages of Black Mountain is not something I can fully describe in correspondence, for reasons that will become apparent. But I will say this. The chambers I surveyed in the fall of 1906 contain physical evidence of continuous human habitation spanning a very long period. Based on the stratigraphy and the condition of the objects, I would estimate the occupation covers several centuries at minimum, possibly far longer. The artifacts include tools, deliberate modifications to natural cave structures, and a substantial quantity of material I can only characterize as records. Not written records in any script I recognize, but systematic markings on prepared surfaces indicating intentional information storage. The chambers have been known to the Dunn family since at least the early 19th century. I found evidence of more recent disturbance, within the last 50 years, consistent with careful, methodical extraction of selected items. Someone has been removing materials from those chambers for decades. I was asked, politely but with unmistakable weight, to revise my findings. I was told that the northern passages were a private concern, and that my professional discretion was both expected and, it was implied, financially rewarded. I accepted the revised terms because I have a wife and 2 young children, and because the men who spoke to me were not the kind of men a person refuses without consequence. I am not proud of this decision. I record it here because I believe what those chambers contain belongs to no single family and no company. I believe it holds significance beyond anything measurable in mineral rights or property values. And I believe the men who presently control access to it understand this perfectly, which is exactly why they guard it with such ferocity. I do not know what will happen when the mining operations inevitably break through to the northern section from below. I suspect the families anticipate this, and I suspect they have contingency plans. I hope those plans do not involve the men who will be doing the digging. With respect and gratitude for your friendship, Foster Dunning. Ray set the letter down. The recorder's office. The courthouse. The ordinary sounds of Harlan outside. All of it felt suddenly remote. He hoped the plans didn't involve the miners, Ray said. Yes, Miss Alma said, and then 11 men died in Shaft 7 in March of 1908. Yes, Miss Alma said again. Her voice was level. She'd had 15 years to absorb this. Why didn't you take this to someone? Ray asked. The letter. The deed language. Why not? Take it to whom? Miss Alma replied, not harshly. The county sheriff calls Robert Dunn by his first name. The state mine inspector filed a report declaring the 1908 explosion accidental. I have no evidence that technically contradicts his finding, only evidence of motive and context. The newspapers in this part of the state are owned by men who understand exactly where their interests lie. She met Ray's eyes steadily. I am a 71-year-old schoolteacher in a cold town in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, she said. I have kept this information alive because I believe that eventually someone would arrive who could act on it in ways I cannot. I've been waiting 15 years. What do you think should be done? Ray asked. I think someone needs to go to North Creek, Miss Alma said plainly. I think someone should see for themselves what the Duns have been pulling from those chambers and keeping on their land. And I think someone should record it in a form that can't be silenced, with photographs, with witnesses, with copies sent to institutions beyond the reach of the Hulbrooks and Warfields and Cordells and Duns. She picked up her book, which Ray understood as her way of closing the conversation. I suspect you already know all this, she added without looking up. I think you came here today to hear somebody else say it out loud. Ray brought everything to Thomas that evening. The deed language, the letter, the full substance of Miss Alma's conversation. He spread it across the small table in Thomas's room at Mrs. Combs's boarding house, the lamp turned high, the window clouded with cold. Thomas read Foster Dunning's letter twice. He sat with it, a long time. Artifacts, Thomas said. Chambers, markings on surfaces. Something ancient, Ray said. Something important enough that 4 of the most powerful families in this county have been shielding it for at least 60 years and letting men die to keep it buried. We can't be certain they killed those men, Thomas said carefully. 11 miners die in the section of the mine closest to those chambers. 2 months after one of the workers assigned there has a mental collapse and gets fired, Ray said. We don't have proof, but we have a sequence. Thomas was quiet. Outside, the fog had descended from Black Mountain earlier than usual, wrapping the street in grey. He thought about Eleanor's most recent letter, about Ruth, 7 years old now, learning to read, about the $11 he'd arrived with, and the money he'd been wiring home. And the plan, the careful, modest plan to bring his family to Harland by summer and build something stable on a miner's wages. He thought about Foster Dunning, who had a wife and 2 children and had made what he called the practical choice, and then spent the rest of his days writing letters confessing to it. The Dunn property, Thomas said. How far? 7 miles north, Ray said. Along the creek road, there's a structure on the land, an old stone building near the water. I found it referenced in the county tax records, listed as a storage facility, built 1871. 1871, Thomas repeated, 10 years after the deed clause requiring the contents to be secured. They built a place to store whatever they pulled from the mountain, Ray said, and they've been filling it for 60 years. Thomas looked at the photograph of Eleanor and Ruth. We go Sunday, he said. Before dawn, we observe. We don't touch anything. We document what we can. Ray nodded. What about Pete? Ray asked. Thomas thought. Pete warned us to be careful, he said. He didn't tell us to quit. He folded Foster Dunning's letter and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Then he turned down the lamp. The room went dark, except for the ashen light seeping through the fogged window and the faint amber glow of Harlan's street lamps below. Somewhere high on the mountain, behind a wall of mortared stone in the deepest section of Shaft 4, the North Tunnel waited in silence, and 7 miles away on North Creek, a stone building erected in 1871 held 6 decades of secrets that 4 families had decided were worth more than the men who stumbled onto them. Thomas had made his decision. What followed would depend on what they found, and on whether the families were still watching as closely as Pete Sorrell believed. It was 1923, and Harlan County pulsed with a kind of energy that bordered on violent. The coal boom had transformed what had once been a scattering of mountain homesteads into a town with real ambition. Brick storefronts along Central Street, a bank with a granite face, 2 hotels that filled every Monday with fresh arrivals, a church whose bell tower climbed high enough above the rooftops to catch the first morning light before anything else in town stirred. The population had tripled in under 10 years. Men had come from Virginia, from West Virginia, from as far south as Alabama, pulled by the promise of reliable pay and that particular brand of hope only desperation can produce. Thomas Aldridge was one of them. 31 years old, built broad through the shoulders, with hands that told his entire story. Calloused from years of farm labor in Wise County, Virginia, a white scar across the left palm from a fencing accident at 19. He'd stepped off the Louisville and Nashville railroad car on a Tuesday morning in March, carrying a canvas bag with 2 changes of clothes, a photograph of his wife Eleanor and their daughter Ruth, and $11. Everything that remained after the drought killed the second harvest in a row. Thomas was not a man given to grand expectations. Life had taught him, slowly and through real suffering, that hope was safest when kept small. He hadn't come to Harland expecting to get rich. He'd come expecting to survive. The Consolidated Black Mountain Coal Company occupied a 2-story brick structure at the corner of Central and Mine Street, its entrance worn smooth by the boots of thousands of men who had stood exactly where Thomas now stood, hat in hand, waiting to be assessed. The hiring manager, a heavy-set man named Cecil Pratt, looked Thomas over with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd evaluated thousands of bodies for their usefulness in tight underground spaces. "You claustrophobic?" Cecil asked, eyes on his ledger. "No, sir." "You got a problem following a foreman's orders, even when those orders don't make sense to you." Thomas hesitated, just a fraction of a second. Cecil caught it. "Every man pauses on that one," Cecil said, glancing up for the first time. "The honest ones do, anyway." "Good. I'll take honest over agreeable every time. Sign here." Thomas signed. He was assigned to Shaft 4, starting Monday. $3.20 a day, 6 days a week, more than he'd ever earned in a month of farming. That night, in the boarding house on Mound Street, run by a widow named Mrs. Dora Combs, Thomas wrote to Eleanor by lamplight. "The work will be hard, but the wages are real," he wrote. "I believe we made the right call. I think this place could be what we need." He sealed the envelope. Sleep came slowly, and when it arrived, it was shallow and restless, the kind that leaves a man more worn out than when he lay down. Shaft 4 descended at a 30-degree angle into the base of Black Mountain, the tallest peak in Kentucky, its summit permanently wrapped in cloud. The entrance was tight enough that 2 men could walk abreast only barely, and it widened as it went deeper, branching into a web of tunnels that experienced miners navigated with the easy confidence of men who'd long since made their peace with darkness. Thomas's crew was 6 strong. Junior Bates, 24, wiry and relentlessly upbeat in the unnerving way of a person who has simply stopped weighing risk. Odell Maynard, 47, born and raised in Harland, working Black Mountain since he was 16, who spoke about the mine the way a man talks about a troublesome family member, with familiarity and unresolved friction. Calvin Price, a black man from Middlesboro, who kept quiet on breaks, but worked with a focus and skill that foreman Walt Gregg acknowledged only through silence, the kind of silence that signals respect in a man who lacks the words to express it. And then there was Pete Sorrell, 53, the oldest in the crew, gray-bearded, with eyes the color of Winter Creek water. Born in Harland County, his father had mined this mountain. His grandfather had logged the ridges above it. Pete held knowledge about this place that no company survey had ever captured. And during Thomas's first week, he barely uttered a word. It was the 5th day, a Friday, cold enough that breath fogged even inside the shaft, when Pete leaned in close during the lunch break and spoke in a voice pitched for Thomas alone. "Ever notice they never assign us anything in the North Tunnel?" Pete said. Thomas looked up from his biscuit. "What North Tunnel?" Pete chewed slowly. "Exactly," he said, and went back to his food. Evenings on Central Street carried the particular charge of mining towns at shift change, men moving through cold air and coal dust toward boarding houses and the two establishments selling liquor under the transparent guise of being pharmacies. Laughter, the occasional scuffle, the smell of frying food and damp wool, and the bone-deep weariness that settles into the shoulders of men who spend their waking hours underground. Thomas fell into a rhythm. Work, eat, write to Eleanor, sleep. He sent money home every 2 weeks. Eleanor's letters back were careful and spare. Updates on Ruth's health, the garden, the cost of flour. Between the lines, Thomas read what she didn't write. Either bring us there, or come home. He made one real friend, Ray Dunford, who worked Shaft 2 and lived 2 doors down at Mrs. Combs's place. Ray was from Knoxville, well read enough to have opinions on several books, and sharp enough to defend them. He was the sort of man who made a hard place survivable by making it interesting. It was Ray who first brought up the families. "You know who actually controls this town?" Ray said one evening, the two of them on the boarding house porch. "Not the coal company, not the mayor. The Consolidated is just the machinery. The real power is 4 families that have been here since before the war. The Holbrooks, the Warfields, the Cordells, and the Dunns." "Landowners?" Thomas asked. "Landowners, yes, but it goes deeper. Those 4 families hold the mineral rights to most of Black Mountain. The coal company leases from them. Every dollar that comes out of that mountain passes through their hands first." Thomas considered this. It wasn't exactly shocking. "So they're wealthy," he said. "Wealthy is one way to put it," Ray said. He went quiet a moment. "What's peculiar is that none of them live in town anymore. They used to, but about 15 years back, all 4 families relocated to their country properties, within roughly 2 years of each other." "Why?" Ray picked at a loose thread on his jacket. "Nobody seems to know, or nobody seems to want to say." In his 3rd week, Thomas was sent to inspect the support timbers in the lower reaches of Shaft 4, a solitary job requiring careful attention and producing the kind of deep stillness that Thomas found, to his own surprise, almost soothing. He was in the lowest section, his lantern throwing long shadows across walls black with coal, when he stopped. A passage branched off to the left at an angle that appeared on no shaft map he'd ever seen. The timbers framing it were far older than anything in the main shaft, nearly petrified, blackened by decades of moisture and pressure. Someone had framed that opening with real skill. Someone had also sealed it shut. The entrance was blocked by a wall of rough-hewn stone, bound with a mixture of concrete and coal dust. It wasn't a cave-in. It wasn't a natural blockage. It was intentional, methodical, and, Thomas estimated the labor involved, expensive. He raised his lantern toward the upper edge of the sealed opening. Beneath a crust of grime, scratched directly into the rock face above the stones, someone had carved 4 words: "Do not go north." Thomas stood motionless for a long time, the full weight of the mountain pressing down through hundreds of feet of rock overhead. He thought about what Pete had murmured over cold biscuits 5 days earlier. "Ever notice they never assign us anything in the North Tunnel?" He gathered his tools. He finished the inspection. He said nothing to anyone. That night, for the first time since arriving in Harland, Thomas didn't write to Eleanor. He sat at the little desk in his room and stared at a blank page, while the fog poured down from Black Mountain, thick and low, consuming the street below his window, the way it did every evening in this place. 4 words cut into stone by a hand long gone, belonging to someone whose name Thomas would never know, whose reasons Thomas couldn't yet fathom, but whose warning, Thomas already felt sure, was meant to be taken at its word. They left Harland at 4 in the morning on a Sunday in early April, when the town was as silent as it ever got, and the fog sat so heavy on the streets that a man could walk from Mrs. Combs's boarding house to the end of Mound Street, invisible from 20 feet away. Thomas carried a lantern wrapped in cloth to dull the light, a notebook and a small camera. a Kodak brownie that Ray had borrowed from a photographer friend in town without explaining the purpose. Ray carried a second lantern, unlit, along with the copied deed language and Dunning's letter tucked inside his jacket. They wore dark work clothes and moved without a word. Pete Sorrell was waiting at the edge of town, right where the creek road split off from Central Street and curved north into the trees. Thomas stopped when he spotted him. Pete looked at both of them with those still winter water eyes. "I told you to be careful," Pete said. "Didn't say I wouldn't come along." Thomas gave a single nod. The three of them turned north and walked into the darkness. The road to the Dunn property followed North Creek for most of its 7 miles, climbing gradually as the valley pinched tighter, the water growing louder as it compressed between steepening banks. The trees flanking both sides were dense second-growth hardwood, the canopy not yet fully leafed, but thick enough to block what little pre-dawn light seeped through the overcast sky. Pete walked point. He knew this road. As a boy, he'd walked stretches of it when the Dunn family still brought in seasonal laborers and a young man could earn $1 hauling fence posts or clearing brush. That had stopped before he turned 20. The family had quit using outside help around 1895, Pete estimated, switching entirely to workers who lived on the property and who, as far as he could tell, had zero social contact with the town of Harland. "How many people are out there now?" Ray asked quietly. 3, maybe 4, Pete said. "Robert Dunn's son Martin runs things. Unmarried. 2 hired hands who've been around as long as I can remember. They come to town for provisions on the first Saturday of every month, predictable as sunrise." "Today's Sunday," Thomas said. "They were in town yesterday," Pete confirmed. "They'll be back on the property by now. But Sunday mornings, Martin drives out to the Baptist church in Cumberland, about 12 miles. Leaves at 7. The hired men don't go." "So we've got a window," Ray said. "We've got a window," Pete said. "If we're on and off the property before 7. Thomas checked his watch in the faint light. 4:42. They quickened their pace. The stone building came into view before the house did. It stood close to the creek, maybe 30 yards from the water's edge, partially screened by a stand of white pines that had been planted, clearly planted, in a deliberate arrangement, to block the view from the road. It was built from the same grey limestone found in Black Mountain's deeper formations, the blocks cut and set with a precision that spoke of expert masonry and real expense. Slate roof. A single door in the south wall, heavy oak reinforced with iron bands, secured by a padlock as big as a man's fist. No windows. Pete studied the padlock, then reached inside his jacket and produced a short pry bar. Thomas looked at him. 31 years making other men rich off this mountain, Pete said quietly. "I figure I'm owed a look." The padlock's iron hasp was old and had endured 60 years of creek moisture. Pete worked at it carefully, and after 4 minutes of steady leverage, the hasp tore free from the doorframe with a sound like a single rap on a hollow log. The door swung open. The smell reached them before the light did. Dry, mineral, deeply old. The scent of sealed stone and something beneath it that Thomas couldn't immediately name. It reminded him faintly of the lowest sections of Shaft 4, but cleaner, as if whatever produced it had been isolated from the mine's wet air and had preserved itself in the stillness. Pete uncovered his lantern. Ray lit the second. The building was a single room, roughly 40 feet long, 20 wide, with a stone floor and a vaulted ceiling peaking at about 12 feet. Along both long walls, built-in wooden shelving extended from floor to ceiling, broken at regular intervals by support posts. The shelves were filled with objects arranged not randomly, but with painstaking order, organized, catalogued, each item or grouping marked with a small, handwritten label. Thomas moved to the nearest shelf and raised his lantern to the first tag. Black Mountain, North Chamber A, Level 3, 1887. The object beside the label was a stone tool, a hand axe, roughly shaped, dark with extreme age. Next to it, wrapped in cloth gone stiff with time, lay something flat and rectangular. Thomas carefully unfolded it to reveal a piece of prepared hide covered in markings, rows of symbols, repeated and varied in patterns that suggested Thomas was no academic, but he possessed a farmer's practical intelligence and a miner's trained eye for detail, something that functioned like language. Or was language. He looked down the length of the shelf. Dozens of objects. Hundreds. He looked at the opposite wall. More shelving, more items, more labels. Chamber A, Level 2, 1891. Chamber B, Level 1, 1894. Chamber B, Level 3, 1903. Ray was moving along the far wall, lantern raised, reading tags in a rapid murmur. "These go back to 1847, he said. "The earliest one I can find, 1847. The same year Elias Holbrook first acquired the mineral rights. They've been extracting material from those chambers for 76 years, Thomas said. Systematically, Pete said. He stood in the center of the room, turning slowly, absorbing it all with the quiet recognition of a man who had suspected something for a long time and was now watching the suspicion solidify into fact. They didn't stumble into this. They knew exactly what was here. They've been managing it. Thomas moved deeper in. Near the back wall, the shelving gave way to a broad, flat table. On the table sat a stack of ledger books, 6 of them, bound in dark cloth, labeled by year. The earliest was dated 1851, the most recent 1921. Thomas opened the 1908 ledger. The entries were written in a careful, formal hand, the hand of someone who understood the gravity of what they were recording and intended the record to be precise. Each entry listed a date, a location within the chamber system, a description of the item removed, and its condition. The descriptions were meticulous and largely clinical. Stone implement, bifacial, approximately 8 inches, excellent condition. Prepared surface with systematic markings, hide substrate, fragile. Structural timber fragment, fire-hardened, with carved notations. Thomas turned pages, February 1908. The entries increased sharply, multiple removals per week, as if someone had accelerated the pace of extraction. Then, March 4th, 1908. A single entry, different handwriting, darker ink, the letters pressed harder into the page, the way a person writes when their hand isn't entirely steady. Shaft 7 North Section crew reached Chamber B lower access point, crew leader informed. Work suspended pending family consultation. Decision reached March 6th. Standard protocol. Entry sealed. March 7th. Standard protocol. Thomas stared at those 2 words for a long time. "Ray," he said. Ray came to the table. Thomas pointed. Ray read it. His face in the lamplight went completely still. "Standard protocol," Ray said. 11 men died on March 12th, 1908, Thomas said, 5 days after the entry was sealed. The 3 of them stood around the table in silence. Outside, the creek tumbled over its stones in the dark, indifferent and unending. Ray uncovered the Brownie camera. Thomas held both lanterns at angles to maximize the available light, while Ray photographed the ledger pages, the 1908 entries specifically, plus several others, demonstrating the operation's systematic scope across decades. He photographed the shelves, the labels, the artifacts. He burned through the entire roll of film, working methodically, moving through the space with the focused efficiency of a man who understands he gets one shot at this and the clock is ticking. Pete stood at the door, watching the approach road. When Ray finished, Thomas placed the ledger back precisely as he'd found it. He checked that nothing had been shifted or disturbed. They backed out of the building, and Pete repositioned the hasp as best he could. Not locked, but arranged to look locked at a glance. Thomas checked his watch. 6:21. "Time to go," Pete said. They went. They were 2 miles down the creek road, moving fast in the strengthening grey of early morning, when Pete spoke. "What are you going to do with it?" he asked, not directed at either of them specifically, but at the situation itself. "Miss Alma said to send copies to institutions the families can't touch," Ray said. "Universities, a federal archive, the photographs, the copied deed language, Dunning's letter, bundled together, mailed to multiple addresses at once. That way, suppressing one copy doesn't suppress them all." "That protects the evidence," Pete said. "It doesn't protect you." "No," Ray agreed. "The instant those photographs reach anyone outside this county, the families will know someone was on that property," Pete said. "They'll know it was someone with knowledge of the 1908 event and access to the deed records. That narrows the list fast." "Then we need to be gone before the photographs arrive," Thomas said. Both men looked at him. "I'd been planning to bring Eleanor and Ruth here this summer," Thomas said. He looked at the road ahead, the creek on his left, the mountain now visible above the tree line, its upper ridges dissolving into cloud. "I'm going to write to Eleanor today. Tell her to go to my brother James. I'll send the photographs and documents to 3 separate addresses: the State University in Lexington, a federal archive in Washington, and a newspaper editor in Cincinnati that Ray knows." "And then?" Ray asked. "Then I work through the week," Thomas said. "Pick up my wages on Friday. And Saturday morning I'm on the first train out of Harland." "They might move before Saturday," Pete said. "They might," Thomas acknowledged. "That's the risk." Pete was quiet a moment. "I have a sister in Corbin," Pete said. "I've been meaning to pay her a visit." Thomas looked at him. "I believe I'll head that way Saturday too," Pete said. The 3 of them walked without speaking for a while. The creek beside them, the mountain at their backs, Harland somewhere ahead in the mist. "Those people in those chambers," Ray said eventually. "Whoever they were, centuries of occupation," Dunning said. "Artifacts, records, an entire body of knowledge preserved in stone." "Yes," Thomas said. "And 4 families spent 76 years pulling it out piece by piece and sealing it inside a stone building on private land," Ray said. "Not researching it, not reporting it, just keeping it." "Keeping it from the public," Pete said. "Which is a different thing entirely. Public knowledge invites government attention. Government attention means losing control of the property. Losing control of the property means losing the mineral rights." "They buried the history of whoever lived in that mountain," Ray said, "to protect a coal lease." Nobody responded. There was nothing to add. They walked into Harland as the first church bells of Sunday morning began to toll, the sound carrying flat and clear through the fog from the steeple on Central Street, and the town stirred slowly around them into its day, oblivious to what 3 men had witnessed on North Creek before the light came up. Ray had the film developed Sunday night in the dark room of his photographer acquaintance, a man named Curtis Webb, who asked no questions, took $2, and delivered 12 prints by 10 o'clock. Ray divided them into 3 sets. Each contained prints of the critical ledger entries, the shelf labels, and the room's overall layout, accompanied by a typed summary of the deed language, Dunning's letter, and the documented chain of events linking the 1906 survey to the 1908 explosion. The first set went to Professor Edmund Hargrove at the University of Kentucky in Lexington, a historian whose published work on Appalachian settlement Ray had read and admired. The second went to the National Archives in Washington, addressed to the Office of the Federal Records Administrator, with a cover letter identifying the materials as evidence potentially relevant to a federal mine safety investigation. The third went to Walter Crane, editor of the Cincinnati Commercial Tribune, with whom Ray had corresponded twice previously on unrelated matters and whose willingness to publish uncomfortable stories Ray believed to be genuine. Thomas mailed a letter to Eleanor that same morning. "Go to James," he wrote. "Don't wait for my next letter. Go now. I'll explain everything when I see you. I'm safe and I'm being careful. Go to James." He didn't elaborate. There wasn't time for explanations, and putting them in a letter felt like a danger he wasn't willing to accept. The week, Monday through Thursday, passed with a surface normalcy that Thomas found more disturbing than open confrontation would have been. The mine ran. The crew worked. Walt Gregg gave orders in his usual flat monotone. Junior Bates was cheerful. Odell Maynard was taciturn. Calvin Price worked with his usual precision and said little. Pete labored alongside them with the same unhurried steadiness he always brought, and Thomas watched him and understood the cost of it. The effort of acting like a man with nothing weighing on him when his mind was full. Ray went to work. Ray ate at the boarding house. Ray read in the evenings and said nothing unusual to anyone. But Wednesday evening, something shifted. Thomas noticed it first at dinner. Mrs. Combs's usual table. 6 boarders, the smell of fried chicken and cornbread. The conversation was ordinary, except for one moment when Harmon Blevins, a surface worker who'd lived at the boarding house for 3 years, mentioned he'd seen Martin Dunn in town. "Thought he only comes in on the first Saturday," someone said. "Usually," Harmon said, and left it at that. Thomas kept his expression neutral. He finished eating. He went to his room and sat at the desk and didn't write a thing. Martin Dunn was in Harland on a Wednesday. The first Saturday had been 6 days prior. There was no reason for Martin Dunn to be in town on a Wednesday unless something had changed. Thomas thought about the hasp on the stone building's door. Pete had repositioned it as well as he could. But as well as he could was not the same as undetectable to a man who checked it routinely. He lay on his bed, stared at the ceiling, and measured the distance between now and Saturday morning. The distance was no longer acceptable. Thursday morning, Thomas found Ray at breakfast and spoke low and directly. Martin Dunn was in town yesterday. Ray set down his coffee. "How sure are you?" "Harmon Blevins mentioned it. No reason to make it up." "The hasp," Ray said. "Possibly, or one of the ledgers. If they inspect that building regularly and something looked off, the photographs took time, the lamp angles, moving through the room." "We were careful," Ray said. "We were careful for men who'd never done anything like this," Thomas said. "I don't know how careful that is against people who've been managing this secret for 70 years, Ray thought. "The packets are already in the mail. They arrive or they don't. Nothing we do now changes that." "No," Thomas agreed, "but we can change when we leave." "I can be on the afternoon train today," Ray said immediately. The speed of his answer told Thomas he'd already been running these calculations. "Pete," Thomas said. "I'll tell him this morning," Ray said. "Before shift." "And you?" Ray asked. Thomas looked at his plate. "I need to get paid Friday morning, not evening. I'll go to the paymaster before shift. Tell him family emergency. They'll dock me half a day. I don't care. That puts you on the Friday afternoon train." "Yes." Ray held his gaze. "Thomas." "I know," Thomas said. "I'll be on it." Thursday afternoon, Ray boarded the 2:15 to Corbin, where he'd connect to Lexington. He clasped Thomas's hand on the boarding house porch with the grip of a man who isn't sure he'll grasp that hand again and wants the gesture to matter. "If Hargrove gets that packet," Ray said, "this doesn't stay quiet. A historian at a state university with documented evidence of suppressed archaeological sites and a covered-up mining disaster. That becomes a story." "If he gets it," Thomas said. "He'll get it," Ray said. "I addressed it to his university office and his home. The families can't intercept mail at 2 separate locations without raising flags." Thomas nodded. "Go." Ray went. Thomas watched the train pull out of Harland Station until it rounded the ridge and vanished. Then he walked back to the boarding house through the afternoon fog and began packing his canvas bag. Pete came to Thomas's room at 7 that evening. He knocked twice, softly, and Thomas let him in. Pete looked at the half-packed bag on the bed. He nodded, as though confirming what he already knew. "Martin Dunn went to the sheriff's office this afternoon," Pete said. "I watched him go in. Stood across the street. He was inside for 40 minutes. Thomas sat on the edge of the bed. "The sheriff," Thomas said. "Lon Combs. Distant cousin to your landlady. No other connection. He's been sheriff 11 years. He's not a crooked man in the usual sense. He doesn't steal, doesn't plant evidence. But he understands where the gravity lies in this county, and he has never, in 11 years, done a single thing to shift it." "What do you think Dunn told him? That someone entered his property without permission and tampered with materials in his storage building," Pete said. "Which is accurate. He may also have said who he suspects. That may also be accurate, depending on how closely they've been watching." Thomas was silent a beat. "I'm leaving on the first train tomorrow," Thomas said. 6:15, before the paymaster opens. "The wages," Pete said. "Don't matter," Thomas said. And he was surprised by how completely he meant it. A week's pay didn't matter. Eleanor and Ruth safe with his brother James mattered. The packets in the mail mattered. Getting on a train before Lon Combs found a specific reason to detain him mattered. The wages did not. "I'll be on the 6:15 too," Pete said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't." Pete was already at the door. 6 o'clock, platform. Thomas didn't sleep. He finished packing. It took 12 minutes, then sat in the chair by the window and watched the fog on Mound Street. He thought about everything that had happened in the 7 weeks since he'd stepped off the Louisville and Nashville car with $11 and a canvas bag. He thought about the sealed passage in Shaft 4 and the 4 words above the stone wall. He thought about Pete's uncle, home sick with influenza the week 11 men died. He thought about Foster Dunning, who'd made the practical choice and spent the rest of his life writing letters about it. He thought about Miss Alma Pigg, 71 years old, guarding a 15-year-old secret in a house overflowing with newspapers because she believed someone would eventually come along who could do what she couldn't. He thought about the stone building on North Creek and the shelving running floor to ceiling and the ledger entries in their precise, formal script. 76 years of systematic extraction from chambers that had held human knowledge for centuries. The tools and the prepared hides and the patterned markings that functioned like language, arranged on wooden shelves with handwritten labels, locked behind an iron-banded door, hidden from the world so 4 families could maintain their grip on a coal lease beneath a mountain. He thought about the people who had inhabited those chambers, who they were, what they understood, what they'd tried to preserve. He thought about how history actually works, how much of it hinges on who controls what gets written down, what gets labeled, what gets locked away, what gets placed on a train bound for a historian in Lexington or sealed inside a stone building on a private creek. At 5:30, he put on his jacket, picked up his bag, and took one last look around the small room. The desk where he'd written letters to Eleanor, the lamp, the photograph. He took the picture of Eleanor and Ruth from the desk and slipped it into his jacket pocket, next to Foster Dunning's letter, which he'd carried there since Sunday. He went downstairs quietly, left $2 on the kitchen table for Mrs. Combs, more than he owed, which felt right, and stepped out into the pre-dawn dark. Pete was already on the platform, a dark shape at the far end, his bag at his feet, looking north up the track. The fog was thick, and the platform lamps made pale yellow halos in the gray that lit almost nothing. Thomas walked to where Pete stood. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say that hadn't been said, and men who've worked underground together for weeks develop a comfort with shared silence that other friendships need years to build. At 6:08, Thomas heard footsteps behind them on the platform. He turned. Sheriff Lon Combs walked toward them from the station house end of the platform. He was tall, unhurried, wearing his coat against the chill. A deputy trailed him, young, hanging a step back, uncertain of his role in whatever this was. Combs stopped 6 feet from Thomas and studied him with the measured look of a man who's been given information and is checking it against what he sees. "Thomas Aldridge," Combs said. "Not a question." "Yes, sir." "You work Shaft 4 at the Consolidated?" "I do." Combs looked at the bag. "Going somewhere?" "Family emergency," Thomas said. "My wife." "I received a letter." Combs considered this. "Martin Dunn tells me someone entered his property Sunday morning, his storage facility on North Creek." "I don't know anything about that," Thomas said. The fog drifted between the platform lamps in slow, weightless currents. The track stretched north and disappeared into gray. Combs held Thomas's gaze for a long moment. He was, as Pete had described, not a corrupt man in the conventional sense. He was a man who understood weight and where it rested. He was also, Thomas now saw, a man who was not entirely at ease with what he'd been asked to do on a cold Friday morning at a train platform. "The Dunn family," Combs said slowly, "has been in this county since before my father was born. They are significant people." "Yes, sir. They've asked me to look into this matter." "I understand." Another pause. The distant sound of the train, still a few minutes out, pushing through the mountain gap to the north. "Your wife," Combs said. "She in Harland?" "No, sir. Wise County, Virginia." "You have family there?" "A brother," Thomas said. "James Aldridge. I'm headed to his place." Combs looked at him, at the bag, at Pete, who hadn't moved or spoken. "I don't have cause to hold you," Combs said. The words were measured and deliberate, chosen with a precision that told Thomas they weren't accidental. "A man's free to travel." "Thank you, Sheriff," Thomas said. Combs gave a single nod. He looked at both of them for another beat, then turned and walked back toward the station house. The deputy followed, glancing once over his shoulder. Thomas exhaled. The 6:15 pulled in on schedule, its headlamp carving a bright tunnel through the fog, brakes groaning against the frozen rails as it eased into the station. Thomas and Pete were the only ones boarding at Harland. Thomas chose a window seat on the west side of the car, away from the platform, set his bag on the overhead rack, and sat down. Through the glass, he could see Sheriff Combs standing with his deputy on the platform, watching the train without expression. The train lurched forward. Harland's buildings slid past the window, the brick storefronts of Central Street, the church steeple whose bell he'd heard ringing on Sunday morning coming back from North Creek, the coal company's office at the corner of Central and Mine, the boarding house on Mound Street where $2 sat on Mrs. Combs's kitchen table. And then the buildings ended. And there was only the mountain. Black Mountain, rising above the tree line to the east, its summit lost in cloud the way it always was. The way it had been every single morning Thomas spent in Harland. He watched it until the track curved and it slipped from his window. He reached into his jacket pocket and touched Foster Dunning's letter. Then he pulled out the photograph of Eleanor and Ruth and held it in his lap, studying it in the grey morning light filtering through the glass. Pete sat across the aisle, facing forward, hands resting on his knees. The train pushed north through the fog, through the gap between the ridges, away from Harland County and its coal and its 4 families and its stone building on North Creek, carrying 2 men and everything they knew toward whatever waited on the other side. Professor Edmund Hargrove received the packet the following Wednesday. He read it in his office at the University of Kentucky, read it a second time, and then sat for a long while with the materials spread across his desk before he reached for the telephone. The Cincinnati Commercial Tribune ran a partial account 6 weeks later, citing documentary evidence and named sources that included a letter from a deceased surveyor and deed language drawn from public county records. The article was restrained and factual. It named the 4 families. It described the 1908 explosion and its timing relative to the mining crew's proximity to the northern chambers. The Federal Archive confirmed receipt of the materials in a letter dated May 3, 1923. The Consolidated Black Mountain Coal Company issued no public statement. The Holbrook, Warfield, Cordell, and Dunn families issued no public statement. The Harlan County Sheriff's Office opened no formal investigation, but the materials were in the archive. They were in the university library. They were in the newspaper's files. They existed in multiple locations simultaneously. And the thing about evidence that exists in multiple locations simultaneously is that it cannot be erased. It can be ignored. It can be challenged, minimized, buried beneath the weight of more powerful interests. But it cannot be unmade. Thomas Aldridge arrived in Wise County, Virginia, on a Friday evening in April of 1923. He walked from the train station to his brother James's house through the last golden light of a clear spring afternoon, and Eleanor met him at the gate. He held her and Ruth for a long time without saying a word. When he finally released them, and they went inside, he sat at James's kitchen table and told Eleanor everything. She listened without interrupting. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. "Those people," she said, "the ones who lived in those chambers." "Yes," Thomas said. "Do you think anyone will find out who they were, now that the documents are out there?" Thomas looked down at his hands on the table, the calloused hands, the scar across the left palm. "I think someone will try," he said. "That's the most I can promise. Someone will try." Eleanor nodded. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Outside, the Virginia spring moved gently through the trees, and the evening was still. The mountains in the distance were a soft blue-gray against the fading sky, gentler than Kentucky's mountains, less swallowed by fog, their outlines clean and legible against the horizon. Thomas looked at them for a long time. He thought about Black Mountain, about the north tunnel sealed behind mortared stone, about the chambers beneath the Dunn property on North Creek, emptied piece by piece across 76 years. The objects now resting on labeled shelves inside a locked room, tagged in a careful hand. About the people who had placed those objects in the mountain in the first place, who had prepared those surfaces, inscribed those markings, built those chambers, and lived in that underground darkness long before any Holbrook or Warfield or Cordell or Dunn had ever set foot in eastern Kentucky. Their names were unknown. Their language had never been deciphered. Their history had been stripped from its original context and sealed inside a room and guarded at the price of 11 men's lives. But it existed. The objects existed. The photographs existed. The ledgers existed, sitting on a shelf in a stone building beside a private creek, waiting for a world that might one day be ready to ask the right questions. Thomas didn't know if that world would arrive in his lifetime. He suspected it wouldn't, but it would come. History moved slowly, and against resistance, and at terrible cost. But it moved, and the things that had been hidden inside Black Mountain for centuries had survived everything that had been done to suppress them. The locked doors, the sealed shafts, the morning in March when 11 men went underground and never came home. They had survived. That, Thomas thought, was what mattered most. Not justice, not yet. Justice was a longer road than any single life could walk. But survival, evidence, the raw material from which someone, someday, would construct the truth. He turned from the window. Eleanor was making coffee. Ruth sat at the table with a schoolbook open in front of her, head bent over the page, one small finger tracing the words as she read. Thomas watched his daughter read. Outside, the mountains held their shape against the darkening sky, patient and indifferent and permanent, the way mountains have always been, keeping their own time, answering to no family, no company, no sheriff, no lease, keeping what they kept, remembering what they remembered.